When Mason pulled me before the investors and introduced me as our family failure, the ballroom thought it was just a cruel wedding joke. Nobody expected the bride's father to remain deadpan, staring at me like I had once saved him from $100 million disaster. 10 minutes later, behind locked doors, he slid a thick file across the table. Do you want to know why your brother rushed to marry my daughter before that project could collapse? My name is Zara Rivers. I am 33 years old, and I spend my life calculating the exact moment things will fall apart. Professionally, I am an infrastructure risk analyst and an urban failure modeler. I work quietly out of a modest apartment in Louisville, taking independent contracts for the Meridian Fault Advisory. My job is to look at the blueprints of massive, glittering civic projects and find the hidden rot. I look for the compromised soil, the inadequate drainage, the cheap steel, the foundation that will inevitably crack under pressure. I find the ugly truth beneath the beautiful surface. It is a lonely, necessary profession, and it is the exact opposite of everything my family stands for. To the Rivers family, I have always been the girl who is smart, but entirely lacks presentation. I am the one who refuses to play the game. In a family that values the illusion of success above all else, my insistence on brutal reality makes me a tedious burden. I am the dark shadow standing behind my younger brother. Mason Rivers. Mason is the golden boy. He is the charismatic, impeccably tailored vice president at Northwake Development Group. He is a man built of pure presentation, a master of the firm handshake and the empty promise. Today is his day, his ultimate transaction, disguised as a wedding. The venue is a sprawling, wildly expensive equestrian estate just outside Lexington. It is the kind of place where the grass looks imported, and the horses probably have better lineage than half the people I went to high school with. The guest list is not a gathering of friends. It is a meticulously curated board of directors. Everywhere I look, I see the apex predators of the Southern economy. There are venture capitalists sipping top-shelf bourbon, real estate lawyers with shark-like grins, investment bankers, and the deeply entrenched old money families of the South. They wear bespoke suits and designer gowns, trading multi-million-dollar insights between bites of seared scallops. The air smells of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the intoxicating scent of consolidated power. I am not a guest here. I am a prop. I understood this the moment I saw the seating chart. I have been placed at a small, wobbly table, entirely obscured by a massive decorative pillar woven with white roses. My seat is functionally closer to the swinging kitchen doors and the harried catering staff than it is to the head table. I am far enough away to be invisible to the important cameras, but present enough to satisfy the bare minimum requirements of familial optics. They invited me simply to check a box, to ensure no one could whisper that the Rivers family was fractured. I am here to make up the numbers, and nothing more. My mother, Linda Rivers, materialized beside my table just as the appetizers were being cleared. She did not ask how I was doing or if I was enjoying the evening. Instead, her eyes immediately locked onto the neckline of my dress. Her hands reached out, pinching and tugging at the fabric with sharp, frustrated movements, as if she were trying to buff a scratch out of a leased luxury car. She treated my physical presence as a minor embarrassment that required constant supervision. "Just try to sit up straight, Zara," she hissed, her smile completely detached from the coldness in her eyes. "And please, for the love of God, do not start talking to people about dirt and cracked pipes. Just be pleasant. Or at least be quiet." Before I could formulate a neutral response, my father, Daniel Rivers, appeared over her shoulder. He held a crystal glass of whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the rim. He did not bother with the physical adjustments. He went straight for the psychological management. He leaned down, bringing the smell of expensive alcohol and peppermint near my face. "Your brother is securing his future today," my father said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "There are people in this room who can make or break our entire family. Do not make things awkward. Just smile, eat your dinner, and stay out of the way. Do you understand me?" "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice completely devoid of inflection. They nodded in unison, a synchronized team of image consultants, and drifted back into the glittering crowd. I took a slow sip of water, feeling the familiar, hollow weight of my family's conditional love. 10 minutes later, the crowd parted, and the golden boy himself approached. Mason moved through the room like a politician on election night. His tuxedo fit him with mathematical precision. His teeth were blindingly white, his hair perfectly swept back. He was laughing at a joke someone had just told, clapping a banker on the shoulder before pivoting toward my hidden corner. As he reached my table, the broad, generous smile remained fixed on his face, a flawless mask for the benefit of the surrounding guests. "Zara," he said, his voice booming with fake warmth. "There you are, hiding in the shadows as usual." He reached out and grabbed my wrist. From the outside, it looked like an affectionate, brotherly gesture, pulling his shy sister to her feet. But beneath the fabric of my sleeve, his fingers dug into my skin with brutal, punishing force. The grip was tight enough to bruise, a sharp physical reminder of who was in control. It was the grip of a warden, not a brother. "Walk with me," he muttered under his breath, his lips barely moving behind the brilliant smile. "And put a damn smile on your face." He dragged me away from the safety of the kitchen doors and out into the center of the ballroom. I felt the heat of the chandeliers and the weight of 100 calculating gazes. He was pulling me straight toward the most powerful cluster of men in the room. Standing at the center of this group was the bride's father, Graham Whitmore. Graham Whitmore was a legend in these circles. As the founder of Whitmore Civic Capital, he controlled billions of dollars in development funds. He was an older man with silver hair and eyes like chipped flint. He did not look like the other men in the room. He did not have the desperate, hungry look of the social climbers. He possessed the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man who already owned everything. Mason halted our march right in front of Graham. He positioned me slightly in front of him, like a hunter displaying a disappointing catch. The conversation among the powerful men naturally died down as the groom claimed the floor. "Graham, gentlemen," Mason announced, his voice carrying the perfect mix of humility and confidence. "I wanted to introduce you to the rest of the clan. You all know my parents. Of course," he gestured broadly, and I saw my mother and father step into the edge of the circle, beaming with pride, ready to bask in the glow of their son's connections. Then, Mason tightened his agonizing grip on my wrist one last time before dropping my hand entirely. He placed his hand flat against my back, pushing me slightly forward into the open space. He looked around the circle of investors, securing their attention, preparing to deliver the punchline. "And this," Mason said, his voice dripping with a rehearsed, joking condescension, "is Zara. This is our family failure." For a fraction of a second, there was silence. Then, the group erupted into polite, booming laughter. The bankers chuckled. The real estate lawyers grinned, shaking their heads at the clever self-deprecation of the groom. It was a brutal, ritualistic humiliation masked as upper-class banter. It was a way for Mason to signal to these ruthless men that he shared their values, that he too despised weakness and unprofitability, even within his own bloodline. I looked at my parents. They were laughing too. My mother covered her mouth delicately, her eyes crinkling in feigned amusement. My father let out a hearty chuckle, raising his whiskey glass toward Mason in a silent salute. They had instinctively chosen their side. They stood united with the man humiliating their daughter, eager to prove their allegiance to the winning team. I stood completely still. I did not flush. I did not look at the floor. I kept my face as blank and unreadable as a concrete retaining wall. I absorbed the impact, cataloging the damage, just as I did in my work. But as the sycophantic laughter rippled through the circle, I noticed the one person who was not participating. Graham Whitmore did not laugh. He did not even smile. The amusement drained completely from his weathered face, leaving behind a cold, terrifying stillness. He stood perfectly rigid, his sharp eyes locking onto mine with sudden, electrified focus. He looked at me not as a joke or a punchline, but as if he had just recognized a ghost. The laughter around us began to die down. Mason's triumphant smile faltered at the edges as he noticed his new father-in-law's stony silence. Graham Whitmore took a slow, deliberate step forward, completely ignoring Mason. It was an expression I recognized from my own line of work. It was the look of an auditor who had just found a critical anomaly in a spreadsheet, the sudden, hyper-focused realization that the numbers did not align. He looked at me, ignoring the sycophantic laughter of the powerful men surrounding us, and seemed to be rapidly cross-referencing my face with a deeply buried professional memory. "What did you say your name was?" Graham asked. He did not direct the question to his new son-in-law. He spoke directly to me. The immediate atmosphere around our small cluster shifted. The surrounding bankers and real estate attorneys, men who made their living reading the subtle cues of power dynamics, instantly sensed the temperature drop. The polite chuckles died in their throats. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to dial down to a dull, distant hum. "Zara," I said, keeping my voice level and my posture straight. "Zara Rivers." Mason let out a short, forced breath, his hand twitching at his side. He stepped slightly into my line of sight, a desperate attempt to physically reclaim the narrative. "Zara handles technical risk work," Mason said, his voice a fraction too loud, the pristine confidence cracking just a millimeter. "Odd technical jobs. It is highly administrative. Nothing you would find remotely interesting. Graham, she is just our little—" "You work with emergency soil assessment and drainage files. Do you not?" Graham asked. He cut Mason off so cleanly, it was as if my brother had not spoken at all. The question was quiet, but it sliced through the remaining tension in the circle like a scalpel. I stood completely frozen. My lungs felt tight. It was an impossibly specific question. Men in Graham Whitmore's position dealt in high-level acquisitions, municipal zoning variances, and nine-figure municipal bonds. They operated in the stratosphere of capital flow. They did not know the grimy subterranean terminology of infrastructure risk mitigation. They paid other firms to worry about hydrostatic pressure and soil compaction. "Yes," I answered, the single syllable feeling heavy in my mouth. "I do." To my right, there was a quiet rustle of heavy silk. Celeste Whitmore, the bride, had stepped closer. She had glided over to join her new husband, expecting to share in a moment of social triumph. But as she looked at her father, her perfect, camera-ready smile dissolved. She was perceptive. She knew the man who had raised her. She recognized that her father was not engaging in eccentric small talk with a disappointing relative. He was interrogating a primary source. He was rattled by something only he could see. "Mason," Graham said, his voice entirely devoid of the paternal warmth he had displayed during the toast 20 minutes prior. "Excuse us. Zara and I are going to have a brief conversation." It was not a request. It was a directive from the top of the food chain. Mason physically recoiled. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking frantically beneath his skin. The golden boy was suddenly drowning in his own carefully constructed aquarium. "Graham, the cake cutting is scheduled in 15 minutes. We really should stay on schedule for the photographers." "We will be 10 minutes," Graham said, his eyes never leaving mine. He gestured toward a velvet-draped archway that led away from the main banquet floor. "If you would please, Miss Rivers." I walked past my brother. I did not look at him, but I could feel the intense heat of his panic radiating from his rigid body. For the first time in his life, Mason had lost control of the room, and he had lost it on the night he was supposed to be crowned. Graham led me down a long, carpeted hallway. The thumping bass of the reception band and the clatter of silver on porcelain faded into a muffled, irrelevant thud. He opened a heavy oak door, ushering me into a private reception room. It was dark, paneled in mahogany, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive leather. The contrast to the blinding light and noise of the ballroom was violent. It was quiet, sterile, and entirely functional, a room designed for closing deals and burying liabilities. Graham closed the door behind us. The heavy brass latch clicked shut, severing us from the wedding. He walked over to a small, antique writing desk in the center of the room. He did not offer me a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He did not offer me a seat. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a folded document. He placed it flat on the green leather surface of the desk and pushed it silently toward me. It was a photocopy. The edges were worn and curled, the ink slightly faded, suggesting it had been handled repeatedly, obsessively, over a long period. I stepped forward and looked down. My breath caught in my throat. It was a technical risk assessment. Specifically, it was the structural viability report for a massive riverfront redevelopment in Tennessee. The date stamped on the top corner was exactly 3 years ago. The signature line at the bottom of the executive summary bore a single, sharp initial and a last name, Z. Rivers. 3 years ago, Graham began, his voice dropping the last remnants of societal courtesy. I was 48 hours away from authorizing a capital injection of $250 million into that Tennessee waterfront project. I stared at my own handwriting. The memory of that project tasted like cold ash. It was the exact job that had broken my conventional career path. The moment I learned what happens when you tell powerful men a truth they cannot afford to hear. The internal audits provided to my firm were pristine, Graham continued, pacing a tight, slow circle behind the desk. The environmental impact studies were glowing. The retaining wall designs had been approved by 3 separate municipal oversight boards. It looked like the safest, most lucrative municipal bet of the decade. He stopped pacing and tapped a thick, calloused finger directly onto the center of the photocopy. Then, an anonymous contact slipped this preliminary analysis to my risk management director. It was a buried subcontractor report. It detailed fabricated soil contamination metrics, willfully ignored hydrostatic pressure models, and a retaining wall design that was mathematically guaranteed to fail after 3 days of heavy rain. I kept my expression entirely neutral, though my pulse was hammering against my ribs. The primary contractor suppressed that report to maintain the transaction timeline. They deemed the author uncooperative and removed them from the network. They did, Graham agreed softly, leaning his weight onto his hands against the desk. But the author was absolutely right. I pulled my capital out on a Friday. 6 months later, a Category 4 storm hit that region. The soil liquefied just as the math predicted. The foundation trenches collapsed. The site became a total loss, and the primary developers are still facing federal fraud indictments. He pushed himself up, leaning slightly toward me, his eyes searching my face. That report saved my firm from a fatal financial exposure. I spent 2 years trying to find the author to hire them. But the subcontractor chain had dissolved into bankruptcy. The shell companies vanished, and all I had was an initial and a last name, Z. Rivers. Graham straightened up, the heavy silence returning to the room. The muffled sound of applause drifted through the thick walls from the ballroom, a jarring reminder of the celebration occurring just down the hall. And now, Graham said, the words falling like heavy stones onto the desk. My daughter marries a man named Rivers, and he introduces me to his sister, who works in emergency soil assessment. I did not confirm or deny it. The worn piece of paper sitting between us was confirmation enough. I finally understood why he had frozen in the ballroom. He was not looking at a family failure. He was looking at the architect of his financial salvation. You have a very specific talent, Zara, Graham said, his voice deadly calm. You see the fractures before the concrete is even poured. You see the places where men lie to themselves and to their investors, because they want the deal more than they want the structural truth. He turned away from me, looking toward a dark, unlit fireplace at the far end of the room. When he spoke again, the tone had shifted from revelation to a grim, immediate warning. My firm recently finalized the absorption of a new mixed-use residential development. It is a massive portfolio piece. It is called Cinder Landing. I knew the name intimately. Cinder Landing was Mason's crown jewel. It was the cornerstone project that had earned him his vice presidency at Northwake Development Group. Graham turned back to face me, the shadows of the room carving deep lines into his face. Over the past 6 weeks, following the merger, I have been reviewing the internal filings for Cinder Landing. I am looking at the soil density variances. I am looking at the drainage offload projections. I am looking at the vendor lists and the material sourcing. He took a slow, deep breath, and I saw the absolute, terrifying clarity in his eyes. I am seeing the exact same pattern of falsified data, the exact same suppression of structural risk, and the exact same phantom vendor network that I saw in Tennessee 3 years ago. Graham picked up the photocopy of my old report and held it out to me as if he were handing back evidence. "And the man supervising every single one of those technical approvals," Graham said quietly, "is your brother." Looking at the faded ink of my own initials, the mahogany walls of the private reception room seemed to dissolve. The smell of lemon polish was replaced by the stale, recirculated air of a windowless cubicle in a mid-level tier of a chaotic subcontractor chain. 3 years ago, I was not an independent consultant answering only to the math. I was a salaried drone, buried deep within a sprawling, anonymous corporate hierarchy, tasked with scrubbing infrastructure data for municipal bids. My specific function was friction. I was paid to find the mathematical inconsistencies in soil composition, drainage capacity, and load-bearing pressures before the concrete trucks ever arrived. I read the dirt. I spent 10 hours a day staring at geological surveys, looking for the lie in the landscape. The Tennessee Riverfront redevelopment file had landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, my eyes were burning from staring at the dual monitor setup, cross-referencing topographic surveys with historical flood data extending back 100 years. The problem was not that the data was missing. The problem was that the data was entirely too perfect. It was artificially beautiful. Real construction sites are messy. Soil is inherently unpredictable, full of voids and unexpected density shifts. Yet, the environmental contamination logs for this site hovered exactly 0.1% below the federal mandate for mandatory remediation. Every single core sample read like a textbook ideal. The retaining wall schematics utilized a shear strength coefficient that assumed laboratory-perfect dry conditions, completely ignoring the reality of a saturated riverbank environment. The storm surge models conveniently omitted the 50-year flood event metrics, relying solely on a heavily smoothed 10-year average that painted a picture of absolute, serene safety. It was a fabricated reality constructed entirely of spreadsheets and blind optimism. I compiled my findings into an urgent risk assessment memo. I stripped out all the technical jargon and reduced the math to a single, unavoidable conclusion. If the managing firm pushed the development forward under the current schematics, it would not take a catastrophic event to cause a structural failure. A single, extreme rainy season would be enough to overwhelm the compromised drainage system, liquefy the untested soil, and turn the entire multi-block radius into a cascading financial and physical disaster. I submitted the report. The response was not an emergency meeting to discuss my findings and halt the heavy machinery. It was a brick wall. The managing director of my division, a man who smelled of stale coffee and anxiety, pulled me into his glass-walled office and carefully closed the blinds. He did not dispute my math. He did not even look at the appendices I had so carefully prepared. He simply explained the mechanics of the transaction timeline. The primary developers needed the safety certification signed by the end of the week to secure the next tranche of funding, a sum hovering around $50 million. My report was a speed bump on a very expensive, very fast highway. He slid the standard authorization form across his desk, placed a heavy brass pen on top of it, and told me to be a team player. I refused to sign. The retaliation was swift, silent, and entirely administrative. I was not fired dramatically in front of my peers. I was simply starved out of the ecosystem. My access to the central servers was revoked pending a supposed security review. I was reassigned to meaningless archival tasks, organizing files for projects that had been completed 5 years prior. Within 2 weeks, Human Resources presented me with a standard severance package, citing a vague corporate restructuring and noting permanently in my personnel file that I lacked the collaborative spirit required for the role. I was officially labeled difficult to work with. By the time the news of my departure reached my family, Mason had already curated the narrative to suit his own upward trajectory. He was just beginning his meteoric rise at Northwake Development Group, and having a disgraced sister was bad for his brand. He sat at my parents' dining table, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, and explained my termination with an air of tragic, older brother wisdom, despite being 2 years younger than me. He told them I had simply sabotaged my own career. He claimed the corporate environment was too demanding, that I could not handle the pressure of high-stakes municipal bids, that I had cracked under the deadline. "Zara always has to make a big deal out of nothing," he had said, shaking his head mournfully while slicing a piece of roast beef. "She gets lost in the weeds and loses sight of the big picture. She lacks the temperament for the real world." My parents, eager to protect the family's pristine image and entirely unwilling to understand the nuances of structural engineering or corporate fraud, accepted his version of events as absolute gospel. That was the exact moment the label was officially born. I ceased being their daughter who worked in risk analysis and became the family failure. Instead of fighting a battle I could never win against my brother's charisma, I retreated. The professional slide forced me to strip away the vanity of a corporate career. I set up my independent consultancy. I moved into a quiet, functional apartment in Louisville, severed unnecessary social ties, and stopped trying to network with people who only valued the appearance of success. I did not print heavy, embossed business cards. I built a firewall between my work and my personal life, finding a cold, hard comfort in the absolute, undeniable truth of numbers. Dirt does not lie. Steel does not lie. I traded ambition for accuracy. And now, standing in this hushed, expensive room with Graham Whitmore, the entire timeline snapped into terrifying, high-definition focus. Graham had already explained that my buried report had saved his capital, validating the very work that had destroyed my standing. But his revelation about the new Cinder Landing project was a different kind of earthquake altogether. It shifted the ground beneath my feet. He was not just telling me that my brother was tangentially involved in a bad deal. He was telling me that Mason was actively utilizing the exact same fraudulent blueprint that had derailed my life 3 years prior. The artificially pristine soil reports, the phantom vendors, the suppressed drainage risks. It was a replicated methodology of deceit, copied and pasted into a new zip code. Mason was not merely standing near the center of the Cinder Landing file. He was the primary architect of the illusion, the one ensuring the lies were perfectly formatted and legally binding. The humiliation in the ballroom suddenly felt incredibly small, replaced by a cold, rising tide of professional outrage. Mason had built his golden reputation on the same kind of rotten foundation he was now trying to sell to his father-in-law. I looked up from the faded photocopy of my old report, meeting Graham's gaze. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the implication of what had to happen next. I was no longer the outsourced analyst trapped in a cubicle, easily silenced by a middle manager. I was the only person with the specific, historical knowledge required to dismantle the bomb my brother was building beneath this man's empire. "I need an independent review, completely off the books," Graham told me, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet mahogany room. Following the merger, my internal risk department was integrated directly with Northwake's executive team. I no longer trust the chain of command. I need someone who does not exist in their system to tell me exactly what is buried beneath Cinder Landing. I agreed immediately. I did not accept the shadow contract for the money, and I certainly did not do it for the prospect of a prestigious title on a corporate letterhead. I said yes because, for the very first time in my adult life, a man with genuine power was evaluating my worth entirely by the brutal precision of my mathematics, rather than my inability to look the part of a wealthy socialite. He did not care that I lacked charm. He only cared that my numbers never lied. 48 hours later, The suffocating noise of the equestrian estate was a distant memory. I sat in the absolute silence of my small Louisville apartment, the only illumination coming from the harsh blue light of my 3-monitor workstation. I pulled my hair into a tight knot, drank a cup of black coffee, and opened the digital vault. Graham had provided a set of backdoor login credentials, allowing me to bypass the standard administrative firewalls of the newly merged corporate entity. I plunged directly into the raw data servers of Cinder Landing. It was a vast digital labyrinth containing thousands of files, core soil samples, architectural change orders, payment addendums, environmental clearance certificates, and revised construction schedules. To an untrained eye, it was an ocean of mind-numbing administrative paperwork. To me, it was an active crime scene. It only took one night for the first serious irregularities to surface. I began my audit with the hydrology reports, because water is the most relentless enemy of any large-scale infrastructure project. The original, legally approved blueprints for Cinder Landing called for high-capacity subterranean storm culverts, specifically engineered to handle a 50-year flood event. However, when I cross-referenced those blueprints with the actual procurement invoices from the past 2 months, the numbers violently clashed. The pipes they were actively putting into the dirt were rated for a volume 40% lower than the baseline safety requirement. They had secretly slashed the drainage infrastructure to save cash. I immediately pivoted to the foundation logs. The soil along that specific geographic corridor required heavy synthetic reinforcement to prevent the ground from shifting under the immense weight of high-density residential towers. The engineering schematics explicitly mandated high-tensile geogrids. The purchasing orders told a completely different story. The high-grade materials had been quietly swapped out for a significantly cheaper, inferior woven mesh that was mathematically guaranteed to degrade within a decade. Then came the most arrogant lie of them all. I opened the mandated environmental remediation report, a crucial document certifying that the site's previous industrial soil contamination had been successfully neutralized. As I read the methodology section, the phrasing felt strangely familiar. I ran the text through a basic comparison algorithm against public civil engineering records. The result flashed on my screen seconds later. The entire Cinder Landing soil certification was a 98% text match to a public works project completed in Nevada 6 years ago. Someone had simply taken an old, legitimate report, used the find and replace function to swap the county names, and forged a new digital signature at the bottom. The sheer audacity of the fraud made my skin run cold. I needed to know exactly who was executing these lethal changes. I began pulling the corporate profiles of the subcontractors who had been awarded these specific, downgraded tasks. The companies had names carefully designed to sound established and authoritative: Apex Geological Solutions, Meridian Flow Logistics, Vanguard Subterranean. They were all ghosts. I traced their corporate registrations through the state databases. They possessed incredibly thin operational histories, most of them incorporated within the last 8 months. Their listed headquarters were either virtual office mailboxes or vacant suites in dying strip malls. Yet, despite having zero physical footprint, no verifiable employees, and no heavy machinery assets, they were billing the Cinder Landing project for staggering amounts of money. I stared blankly at a single invoice from Meridian Flow Logistics for $350,000, categorized vaguely as specialized site consultation. These shell companies operated like parasites. They appeared repeatedly across the ledgers, but only at the exact friction points where a vital, expensive piece of engineering was replaced by something cheap and dangerous. The money was bleeding out fast, which meant someone inside the company was holding the door open. I tracked the approval chain for every single one of these catastrophic change orders. I followed the digital paper trail upward, watching the requests move from procurement to finance, and finally to the executive suite. Every critical path led to the exact same desk. Every single approval bore the digital authorization of the Vice President of Development, Mason Rivers. He had not signed documents explicitly stating he was compromising the structural integrity of the site. He was much too smart to leave a blunt confession. Instead, The approvals were heavily insulated with layers of dense corporate jargon. He authorized the devastating drainage cuts under the label of aggressive cost optimization. He approved the inferior soil mesh as a strategic supply chain pivot. The forged environmental report was rubber-stamped as a pre-market efficiency adjustment. I pushed my chair back, staring at the 3 glowing screens. I spent the next 4 hours building a massive, interconnected schematic on my center monitor. On the left side of the screen, I mapped the safe, legally sound design that Graham Whitmore believed his capital was funding. On the right side, I mapped the brittle, terrifying reality that was currently being built in the mud. Looking at the 2 structures side by side, the true anatomy of the crime finally crystallized in my mind. This was not a simple embezzlement scheme. Mason and his network were not just skimming cash off the top of the concrete pours to buy sports cars. They were engaged in a massive, systemic transfer of liability. They were intentionally stripping the physical safety out of the project today, pocketing the saved capital through ghost companies, and pushing the catastrophic physical risk onto the future residents and investors. By the time the foundation cracked and the subterranean parking garages flooded 5 or 10 years from now, Mason would have already collected his massive performance bonuses, secured his promotion to the board, and insulated himself behind impenetrable layers of legal distance. He was building a time bomb and selling it as luxury real estate. I leaned forward, my eyes burning from the screen glare, and decided to pull the thread on the most lucrative of the ghost companies. Vanguard Subterranean had billed over $800,000 in vague consultation fees over a span of merely 3 months. I bypassed their fake corporate website and dug directly into the state licensing registry. I needed the name of the registered legal agent who had filed their original articles of incorporation. The database loaded slowly, the progress bar creeping across the screen. The document rendered. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the second page. The legal representative for Vanguard Subterranean was Julian Vance. My breath caught. The name hit me like a physical blow. The sterile digital forensic hunt suddenly collapsed into something violently personal. I did not need to run a background check on Julian Vance. I already knew exactly who he was. 12 years ago, Julian Vance had occupied the bedroom directly across the hall from Mason in their university fraternity house. He was the guy who used to constantly copy my brother's macroeconomics homework. More importantly, he was a guy who had notoriously failed his introductory geology course twice before changing his major to public relations. Now, he was legally listed as the senior subterranean consultant authorizing the foundational stability of a billion-dollar municipal project. My golden boy brother was not acting alone as a sophisticated corporate criminal mastermind. He was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of Whitmore Civic Capital's money directly to his college drinking buddies, using them to sign off on engineering decisions that could literally kill people. The system of fraud was not just cold and calculated, it was deeply, arrogantly familiar. Mason believed he was so untouchable, so fiercely protected by the shiny veneer of his perfect reputation and our family's blind adoration, that he could use his frat brothers to rubber stamp a structural disaster without anyone ever looking twice. I reached for my notebook, the pen heavy in my hand. The investigation was no longer just about proving the math. It was about exposing the lie that had shaped my entire life. Mason did not wait for an invitation. He arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday morning, exactly 9 days after his brief honeymoon in the Maldives. He knocked twice on my door and pushed his way inside before I could even reach the deadbolt. He was dressed in a casually expensive cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and sea salt into my cramped, functional living space. He carried 2 cups of artisan coffee in a cardboard carrier, presenting them with a bright, entirely synthetic smile, as if he were simply a loving brother dropping by for a morning chat. He set the cups down on my cheap laminate kitchen counter, his eyes sweeping over my Spartan furnishings and the complex, multi-monitor workstation humming in the corner. He looked at my life with a poorly concealed layer of pity. "We need to have a proper, private talk," Mason said, keeping his voice carefully modulated, drenched in the smooth, artificial warmth he usually reserved for hesitant investors. Graham mentioned you have been spending some time looking into the Cinder Landing files. He said you were doing a little independent auditing for him. I did not touch the coffee. I leaned against the doorframe of my home office, physically blocking his view of the glowing screens that contained the digital blueprint of his fraud. You do not understand the commercial real estate world, Zara, Mason continued, taking a slow, relaxed sip from his cup. He leaned his hip against the counter, adopting a posture of supreme, relaxed confidence. It is not a sterile laboratory. It is not an academic exercise. Things shift on the ground. Supply chains break down. Material costs fluctuate by the hour. What you are seeing on those servers, those minor paperwork adjustments and vendor substitutions, that is simply industry reality. It is how things actually get built in the real world. If you keep digging around and alarming Graham over standard operational friction, you are going to ruin the incredible life this family has finally built. I stared at his perfectly styled hair and his relaxed, open posture. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, delivered with the smooth cadence of a seasoned executive. I am not looking at normal administrative errors, Mason, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sisterly affection. I am not looking at supply chain friction. I am looking at a deliberate, calculated model. You are intentionally dressing up a compromised asset just long enough to secure the final funding rounds. You are legally certifying a foundation you know is fundamentally flawed, and you are preparing to sell that catastrophic physical risk to the future residents and your new father-in-law. You are not building a residential complex. You are building a facade. The brotherly mask slipped. It did not fall away with a shout or a dramatic gesture. It dissolved quietly, the warm, patronizing smile vanishing to reveal a cold, hardened sneer underneath. He set his coffee cup down on the counter with a sharp, aggressive click. "This is exactly why you are stuck in this pathetic, depressing apartment," Mason said, his voice dropping into a vicious, quiet register that vibrated with genuine malice. "This is your sickness, Zara. You always need to feel morally superior to everyone else, because you cannot actually win in the game of power. You failed out of the corporate world 3 years ago, so now you sit in the dark, playing with spreadsheets, pretending you are the only honest person left on earth. You are playing the martyr because you do not know how to be a victor." He took 2 slow steps toward me, invading my physical space, radiating a suffocating, aggressive energy designed to intimidate. "Do you honestly think a man like Graham Whitmore respects you?" Mason asked, a cruel, mocking smile touching the corners of his mouth. "He does not care about your math. He is using you. He needed a disposable, off-the-books auditor to squeeze my profit margins before he finalizes the capital transfer. The absolute second you give him the leverage he wants, he will throw you right back into the gutter, exactly like your last firm did. You are just a tool, Zara. And when a tool breaks, it gets thrown away." He did not wait for my response. Having delivered his psychological strike, he turned on his heel and walked out of my apartment, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him. The suffocating tension in my apartment lasted precisely 4 hours before the secondary assault began. My cell phone vibrated across my desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. The coordinated family defense strategy had officially been deployed. I answered the call and pressed the speakerphone button, setting the device on the desk next to my keyboard so I could keep my hands free. "Zara, please," Linda Rivers began, her voice trembling with manufactured, breathless distress. She bypassed any normal greeting, launching straight into the emotional manipulation. "You have to stop this immediately. Mason called us. He's incredibly upset. Do not turn your brother's beautiful marriage into a corporate scandal. Celeste is a lovely girl, and they literally just got back from their honeymoon. Why are you doing this to him? Why must you always destroy the nice things in this family?" Before I could even process the absurdity of being blamed for my brother's impending criminal liability, my father's voice cut through the speaker. He was clearly listening on another extension in their house, hovering in the background like a designated enforcer waiting for his cue. Listen to me very carefully, Daniel Rivers said, his tone dripping with cold, patriarchal authority. You are completely out of your depth here. Mason is handling grown-up internal paperwork for a billion-dollar merger. You are looking at a few isolated spreadsheets from your living room and trying to invent a conspiracy because you are deeply jealous of his success. Stand down, Zara. I am telling you right now, I will not allow you to embarrass us in front of the Whitmore family. I looked up from the phone and stared at the glowing monitors in front of me. I looked at the digital maps of fraudulent shell companies, the falsified soil reports, and the forged environmental signatures. My chest felt incredibly tight, but the sensation was not born of sadness or guilt. It was a sudden, violent clarity. The toxic, confusing fog they had kept me trapped inside for over 3 decades instantly evaporated. You do not actually care about the truth, I said, my voice steady, cutting cleanly through my mother's quiet, dramatic sobbing on the line. And you do not even care about Mason's well-being or his freedom. The only thing you are protecting right now is not this family. You are protecting your right to stand close to money. You are protecting your proximity to rich people. You would rather let him commit a massive federal felony than risk losing your new country club invitations. How dare you speak to your parents like that? My father snapped, the cold composure finally cracking into genuine anger. I reached forward and ended the call. I did not block their numbers. I simply severed the immediate connection, letting the heavy dead air fill the room. I took a deep, shuddering breath and turned my attention back to the third monitor. I needed to finish the forensic accounting. I had been running a deep financial trace on Vanguard Subterranean, the ghost company managed by Mason's former college roommate. I needed to see exactly where the stolen capital was bleeding out after it left the primary construction accounts and entered the shell company's ledger. I bypassed the standard vendor payment systems and ran a specialized script designed to follow secondary banking transfers. The screen populated with a dizzying cascade of routing numbers and offshore holding accounts. I filtered the massive block of data, isolating a single, massive payout issued exactly 3 days before the wedding ceremony. It was a wire transfer for $250,000. I highlighted the routing number, accessing a public banking registry to pull the legal registration data for the receiving account. I fully expected to find another shell corporation, or perhaps an offshore tax haven controlled by Mason. The database loaded the destination credentials. It was not a corporate holding firm. It was a private, newly established domestic family trust fund. I stared at the screen, reading the beneficiary names listed on the legal trust document. The account belonged to Daniel Rivers and Linda Rivers. The encrypted message arrived on my secondary phone less than 24 hours after I found the wire transfer to my parents. It did not come from Graham or one of his corporate attorneys. The sender simply dropped a geographic pin for a diner 30 miles outside the city limits and attached a single line of text. If I give you what you need, will you tell me what he is hiding from me? I drove out to the location the next morning. It was a bleak, aluminum-sided coffee shop situated off a dying stretch of the interstate, completely removed from the polished equestrian estates and the high-rise financial districts. It was exactly the kind of place where people who owned nothing went to be ignored. Celeste Whitmore was already sitting in a booth near the back, facing the door. The bride from the magazine covers was gone. She wore a heavy wool coat over dark jeans, her hair pulled back into a severe clip. The flawless, radiant makeup had been scrubbed away, revealing the pale, exhausted face of a woman who was slowly realizing she had legally bound herself to a stranger. I slid into the vinyl booth across from her. We did not exchange pleasantries. We did not order coffee. Celeste reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it flat on the table between us, keeping her manicured hand pressed firmly against the clasp. My father told me to stay out of the corporate review, Celeste said, her voice low and remarkably steady. He told me to go to the spa, to focus on the new house renovations, and to let his legal team handle whatever irregularities they found. But I know my father. I know the tone he uses when a deal is dead, and I know the tone he uses when he is preparing to destroy someone. He is building a guillotine. Zara. And he is building it for my husband. I looked at her hand resting on the envelope. He is building it because your husband supplied the lumber. Celeste did not flinch. She simply slid her hand away, pushing the envelope an inch closer to me. I need to know the architecture of the lie. I am a Whitmore. I do not play the role of the naive, betrayed wife for anyone. Open it. I broke the clasp and pulled out the stack of documents. They were not technical schematics or soil density reports. They were private communications. There were printed email chains between Mason and his legal counsel, draft revisions of their prenuptial agreement, and handwritten notes from closed-door meetings with the primary underwriters for the new development. Look at the dates, Celeste instructed. Tapping the top page, I scanned the headers. The emails were sent in the chaotic, high-stress weeks immediately preceding the wedding ceremony. Mason became obsessed with the capital closing announcement, Celeste explained, her eyes tracking my reactions. He wanted the final, unchangeable funding locked in exactly 48 hours before we walked down the aisle. He framed it as a romantic gesture. He told me he wanted to start our marriage with a clean slate, with his biggest career victory firmly secured so we could just focus on us. But behind closed doors, he was frantic. He was racing against an invisible clock. I read through an email chain where Mason was forcefully pushing the risk underwriters to accept a highly irregular milestone schedule. When the lead underwriter pushed back, requesting more time to verify the geotechnical data, Mason did not argue the math. He used her name. He invoked my father, Celeste said bitterly, watching me read the exact paragraph. He told the underwriters that Graham Whitmore had personally reviewed the site projections and was entirely satisfied. He implied that holding up the paperwork would be seen as an insult to the Whitmore family right before the wedding. He weaponized our relationship to bully the compliance officers into submission. I moved to the next document. It was a confidential internal memo from the Municipal Zoning Board, dated 3 weeks prior to the reception. It was a formal stop work warning. The city had flagged the Cinder Landing site due to incomplete foundation assessments. He hid that from everyone, Celeste whispered, the betrayal finally cracking the edges of her composure. We were doing cake tastings and picking out floral arrangements while his flagship project was legally paralyzed. Do you see what he did? Zara, he did not marry me because he loved me. He married me because he needed a shield. The horrifying genius of Mason's strategy suddenly clicked into place. The fraudulent shell companies, the compromised building materials, the doctored environmental reports, they were all massive liabilities that were bound to trigger alarms eventually. But Mason knew that no one in the Southern financial establishment would dare audit the Golden Boy while he was standing at the altar with Graham Whitmore's daughter. The wedding was not a celebration. It was a calculated social distraction designed to soften the scrutiny and rush the final, irreversible transfer of funds before the concrete cracked. He used the marriage as the final, load-bearing pillar in his architecture of deceit. I carefully stacked the papers and slid them back into the envelope. The evidence she had provided was the exact missing link I needed to prove intent. It proved that Mason was not just a negligent manager. He was actively, desperately coercing the financial apparatus to ignore the physical reality of the site. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, looking directly into her eyes. "You could have taken this straight to your father." Celeste shook her head slowly. "Because my father looks at this as a breach of contract. He looks at it as an insult to his firm. But you and I, we are the ones standing inside the blast radius." She paused, looking out the diner window at the empty highway for a long moment before turning back to me. "For the first 6 months I knew Mason. He told me stories about you." Celeste confessed, her voice thick with regret. "He painted this tragic, pathetic picture. He said you were the family failure, the bitter sister who could not cut it in the real world, and blamed everyone else for your mistakes. And I believed him. I believed the Golden Boy because it was easy. But then I saw my father look at you at the reception. My father does not look at failures like that. He looks at peers like that." She reached across the table, not to shake my hand, but to simply tap the envelope one last time. "Mason sold me a fake marriage, and he sold you a fake reputation," Celeste said, her tone hardening into pure steel. "He convinced your own parents to applaud while he humiliated you. He convinced me to smile for the cameras while he used my name to steal from my family. Everything was told wrong from the very beginning." We sat in silence in the cheap vinyl booth. Two women from entirely different ends of the social and economic spectrum, suddenly anchored by the exact same betrayal. We were the collateral damage in Mason Rivers' aggressive expansion plan. Celeste needed the absolute, unvarnished truth to sever the legal ties and protect her family's legacy from the impending fallout. I needed the truth to finally tear off the suffocating label my brother had bolted to my chest. "I will give you the structural proof," I told her, my voice dropping to a low, absolute promise. "I will give you the exact mechanism of his fraud, down to the final dollar and the last compromised steel beam." Celeste nodded once, picking up her leather tote bag. She stood up, leaving the envelope on the table. "Finish it, Zara," the bride said. Before turning and walking out into the cold morning air, I traced the trust fund disbursement with the mechanical detachment of a mortician. The $250,000 did not sit idle in the newly established family account. Less than 48 hours after it arrived from Vanguard Subterranean, it was wired out again. The destination was a commercial mortgage lender. I pulled the property records for the exact account number. It was the deed to my parents' 5-bedroom colonial estate. The phantom consulting profits from my brother's fraudulent geotechnical firm had been used to entirely liquidate a massive refinancing loan my parents had quietly taken out 2 years ago. They were not innocent. They might not understand the complex fluid dynamics of hydrostatic pressure or the legal nuances of environmental compliance, but they absolutely understood the texture of dirty money. They knew Mason was bringing in a heavy, continuous stream of cash that required no questions and demanded absolute loyalty. I did not call them. I drove to their house. The afternoon sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their pristine sunroom when I walked in. My mother was arranging imported hydrangeas in a crystal vase. My father was reading a financial newspaper. The domestic tranquility was violently suffocating. I did not yell. I simply walked to the glass coffee table and placed the printed routing numbers and the Vanguard Subterranean corporate filings directly over the lifestyle magazines. "Your mortgage is clear," I said, my voice completely devoid of volume. It was paid off by a ghost company legally registered to Mason's former college roommate, a company that is currently billing the Whitmore estate for subterranean work that does not exist. "Your son is legally compromising a billion-dollar residential tower to buy your comfort." My mother dropped a stem of hydrangeas onto the marble floor. Her hands fluttered to her mouth, and her eyes filled with immediate, defensive tears. She did not express horror at the criminal liability. She expressed horror that the arrangement was being spoken aloud. "Mason was just helping the family through a tough time," she sobbed, sinking into a linen armchair. "The club dues were rising. The property taxes were doubling. We were drowning. Zara, your brother stepped up to protect our home. You cannot blame a son for taking care of his parents. Taking care of you by committing federal wire fraud," I replied, the chill in my chest spreading to my fingertips. My father calmly folded his newspaper. He did not look at the documents on the table. He looked directly at me with a chilling, pragmatic emptiness. "It is just internal corporate maneuvering," Daniel said, his tone utterly flat. "Everyone does what they have to do to maintain their position in this world. The money moves, the buildings go up, and the people who understand the mechanics get rewarded. Mason simply knows how to play the game." He stood up, walking over to the silver bar cart to pour himself a scotch. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, familiar sound that anchored every memory of my childhood. "I am not surprised you are doing this, Zara," he continued, keeping his back to me. "You have always lacked the stomach for how high-level business actually operates. It is exactly like that incident 3 years ago. When you refused to sign that safety certification in Tennessee, you embarrassed us. You had a clear path to the executive track, and you threw it away over a pedantic mathematical argument. I told all our friends at the club that very week. I told them my daughter was smart, but she simply did not know how to survive the real world. You did not know how to play the rules. The air left my lungs. The room suddenly felt incredibly small, the walls closing in with the weight of a decade-long realization. Mason had not invented the label. He had not originated the cruel narrative that I was the family failure. He had inherited it directly from the patriarch. My father had built the weapon, and Mason had merely polished it, sharpening the blade and using it as a public shield to deflect attention from his own rotting morals. I had spent my entire adult life believing my brother was my primary abuser, only to realize the poison had been seeping from the roots of the family tree the entire time. I turned around and walked out of the sunroom. I did not say another word. There was nothing left to say to people who had priced their daughter's reputation against the cost of a mortgage. That evening, I sat in the hushed, mahogany-paneled office of Graham Whitmore. I laid the final pieces of the financial trace on his desk, showing him the direct line from his capital funds to my parents' bank account. Graham looked at the papers, and then he looked at me. The hard, calculating edge in Graham's expression softened into something that looked almost like pity. "You have done enough, Zara," Graham said quietly, steepling his fingers. "You have handed me the blueprint of the theft. I can take it from here. I will deploy my legal team tomorrow morning. We will freeze the accounts, secure the site, and quietly dismantle him before the week is over. You can step away. You do not need to be in the room when it all comes down." I looked at the silver-haired man who had recognized my worth in a crowded ballroom. I appreciated the offer of protection, but he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war I was fighting. "No," I told him, my voice steady and cold. "If your lawyers take over, this just becomes another sealed corporate settlement. It becomes a quiet resignation and a non-disclosure agreement. I am not doing this to protect your balance sheet. Graham, this is no longer just a corporate file. This is the falsely written history of my life. I need to be the one holding the pen when the final chapter is recorded." Graham studied my face for a long, silent moment before giving a single, decisive nod. We spent the next 2 hours constructing the trap. Celeste joined us via a secure video link from the master bedroom of her new marital home. We agreed on a strategy of absolute, terrifying silence. For the next 4 days, we would offer no resistance. Celeste would continue to play the role of the devoted, oblivious bride. Graham would continue to play the satisfied, hands-off investor. I would disappear entirely, projecting the image of the defeated, intimidated sister who had finally been bullied into submission. We needed Mason to feel invincible. We needed the sudden lack of friction to feed his staggering arrogance. If he believed his aggressive visit to my apartment had successfully terrified me into silence, he would accelerate his timeline. He would feel safe enough to sign the final, irrevocable documents required to lock the fraudulent structure into place. The silence worked beautifully. 3 days later, I was sitting at my workstation, watching the digital logs of the Cinder landing server. The system was quiet. Then, my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from Mason. "Good. You finally understand your place." It was the ultimate expression of his hubris. He was gloating from his corner office, convinced he had successfully crushed the only remaining threat to his empire. He thought I was cowering in the dark. I did not reply to his message. I simply looked up at my primary monitor. At the exact moment his text had arrived, my secure inbox chimed with an automated alert from the municipal procurement server. It was a digital copy of the final, massive change order for the Cinder Landing foundational retaining wall. It was the document that legally stripped the last remaining safety margins from the multi-million-dollar structure. I opened the file and scrolled to the bottom of the page. There, resting quietly on the signature line, was the digital authorization stamp belonging to Mason Rivers. He had just signed the document that would destroy him. I spent the next 72 hours building a dynamic structural collapse simulation. I did not rely on static blueprints or isolated spreadsheets. I fed the altered cinder landing schematics into a predictive weather model, applying the historical precipitation data for a standard, heavy rainy season in the region. The results rendered on my center monitor not as a sudden, dramatic explosion, but as a slow, agonizing, mechanical death. The mathematics were ruthlessly clear. The downgraded woven mesh gave way first under the saturated weight of the earth. Then, the localized subsidence began. The soil liquefied beneath the northern residential quadrant, systematically cracking the massive foundation slab. Water breached the subterranean parking levels, rising fast enough to submerge the lower utility grids within 48 hours of continuous rainfall. In the real world, this would not just mean wet concrete and delayed schedules. It meant immediate structural condemnations, mass tenant evacuations, and a cascading wave of catastrophic insurance disputes that would bankrupt the developers. It was a mathematical guarantee of failure, perfectly hidden beneath a layer of polished marketing. Graham Whitmore received my final simulation model on a secure drive. He did not take my findings to his corporate board of directors. Boardrooms leak. Executive committees are prone to panic, and panic creates noise. Instead, Graham quietly and methodically assembled the people who could stop the deal. He bypassed his internal executives entirely and reached out to the external entities who held the ultimate financial leverage over the project. Operating completely off the grid, he scheduled a final, closed-door risk review. He sent private invitations to the lead underwriters of the municipal bonds, the senior risk adjusters from the primary construction insurance syndicate, and an independent legal counsel specializing in high-stakes corporate fraud. He brought in the people whose money was actively being stolen. They were not coming to debate architectural theory. They were coming to evaluate a multi-million-dollar crime scene. The success of this trap relied entirely on the absence of friction. We needed Mason to feel invincible. Celeste executed her role in this psychological warfare with terrifying perfection. Inside their sprawling new marital estate, she maintained a flawless facade of domestic bliss. She poured his morning coffee, discussed interior paint swatches for the guest bedrooms, and smiled warmly when he talked about his grueling days at the office. She gave Mason the ultimate, blinding gift of normalcy. She sat across from him at the dinner table, watching him drink expensive wine, perfectly concealing the fact that she was looking at a man whose collapse had already begun. Lulled into a state of absolute security by his wife's apparent ignorance and my engineered silence. Mason's arrogance metastasized. He believed he had successfully neutralized every threat. Operating under the delusion of total control, he aggressively pushed his finance department to circulate a massive investor presentation to their top-tier clients. The glossy 70-page brochures explicitly described the Cinder Landing Foundation as technically stable, environmentally pristine, and fully ready for vertical construction. Worse, his hubris pushed him to demand an immediate payout. He officially authorized an additional $500,000 performance bonus for himself, tying his personal compensation to the exact fraudulent developmental milestones he had just forged. As he was busy counting his unearned money, I found the final piece of proof. I was running the microscopic sweep of the environmental sign-offs when I noticed a strange artifacting on a digital signature block. It was attached to a crucial soil toxicity clearance form, dated merely 2 weeks ago. The name on the digital stamp belonged to a senior geotechnical auditor. I ran the name through the state licensing database and cross-referenced it with the internal vendor payment logs. The auditor was a real person, but his employment contract with Northwake Development Group had been permanently terminated 8 months prior. Mason had not just lied about the soil composition. He had copy-pasted a dead digital signature from a fired employee to authorize a living legal document. This was the kill shot. It elevated his actions from gross managerial negligence or aggressive cost-cutting into undeniable, premeditated federal forgery. The final attempt at damage control did not come from my brother. It came from the man who had taught him how to manipulate the world. Daniel Rivers requested a meeting. I did not let him into my apartment. I forced him to meet me in the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby of my building. He wore a sharp, tailored gray suit, standing near the security desk like a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. He did not offer an apology for the trust fund money. He did not ask how I was sleeping or if I was okay. He simply delivered a demand, his voice dripping with aristocratic entitlement. "I know you have Graham's ear right now, Zara," Daniel said, keeping his voice low, his eyes constantly scanning the lobby to ensure no one was listening. "I know you are trying to make a point about your little numbers. But I am telling you, as your father, do not make this a public spectacle. Whatever administrative issues Mason has with his paperwork, they can be handled quietly behind closed doors. Do not humiliate this family in public. Do not ruin our name over your petty jealousy." I looked at the man who had spent his entire life valuing optics over oxygen. He was still trying to manage my behavior, still trying to force me into the mold of the quiet, obedient disappointment. "You taught me a very clear lesson, Dad," I replied, my voice as hard and unyielding as the concrete floor beneath us. "You taught me that people do not care about the process or the truth. They only care about the results. You spent years telling everyone at your country club that I failed because I did not know how to play the game of power. So, I am stepping out of the game. If people only listen to results, I am going to let the results speak for me. And I am going to let them speak very loudly, in front of absolutely everyone." I turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving him alone in the cold lobby. He did not call after me. I immediately sent a single, coded message to Graham. The net was fully woven. The evidence was irrefutable. The only thing left was to choose the exact hour of the execution. We aligned our schedule with Northwake Development Group's internal corporate calendar. The fateful closed-door risk review was firmly set for a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. It was the exact same day, and the exact same hour, that the executive board was scheduled to publicly announce Mason's highly anticipated promotion to senior vice president. We engineered a flawless, devastating collision course between his ultimate professional ascension and his absolute destruction. The trap was not built with shouting or threats. It was built with his own signature, waiting silently in the dark. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Northwake Tower offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Cinder Landing site. Down below, yellow cranes moved like slow metal insects over acres of raw, excavated earth, building a monument to a lie. Inside the glass-walled room, the atmosphere was meticulously engineered for an absolute, undeniable victory. The long mahogany table was polished to a dark mirror finish. Silver carafes of hot, dark roast coffee sat beside delicate porcelain cups. At each leather chair rested a thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the final capital closing agreements and the projected 10-year revenue models. The massive presentation screen at the head of the table glowed brightly with the Northwake Development Group corporate logo, waiting to display the financial triumph of the decade. Mason had arrived 45 minutes early to claim his territory. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, adjusting the pristine knot of his silk tie, his posture radiating the relaxed, magnetic confidence of a man about to be formally crowned. He greeted the arriving senior executives with firm handshakes, clapping shoulders, and dispensing practiced, easy laughter. He truly believed that by 10 o'clock, he would not only be named senior vice president, but would officially cross the threshold into the untouchable inner sanctum of the Whitmore Empire. He was operating under the intoxicating illusion of total supremacy. Sitting near the center of the long table, positioned proudly as the groom's guests of honor, were my parents. Linda wore a perfectly tailored pastel suit, her posture rigidly elegant, her hands resting gracefully in her lap. Daniel sat beside her, projecting the quiet, deep satisfaction of a patriarch whose ultimate, lifelong investment was finally paying off in spectacular fashion. They surveyed the room with bright, hungry eyes. They were eagerly waiting to witness the exact moment their golden son formally elevated the entire Rivers family into a new, untouchable stratosphere of wealth and social dominance. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked in. I did not wear a designer suit. I did not attempt to mimic the sartorial armor of the billionaires in the room. I wore a simple, structured charcoal blazer and carried a single, unmarked black laptop, but it was not my attire that caused the ambient hum of wealthy conversation to instantly evaporate. It was the company I kept. I walked through the doors, flanked tightly by Graham Whitmore on my left and Celeste Whitmore on my right. The room went completely, deadeningly quiet. The transition was so violent, you could hear the soft hum of the climate control system. The sycophantic smiles froze instantly on the faces of the bankers. My mother's hand stopped halfway to her coffee cup, hovering over the saucer. Mason turned away from the window, his brilliant, welcoming smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He tried to quickly recover, stretching his mouth back into a grin to maintain the facade, but the muscles around his jaw twitched erratically. His eyes darkened rapidly as they darted between his father-in-law, his wife, and the sister he thought he had successfully terrorized into submission. He realized, in real time, that the pieces on the chessboard had moved entirely without his permission. He no longer controlled the gravity in the room. Graham did not walk to the head of the table to take his usual seat of honor. He did not shake my brother's outstretched hand. He did not offer a booming, affectionate congratulatory toast to the room. Instead, he signaled to the three men who had quietly entered the room directly behind us the lead underwriter for the municipal bonds, the senior risk adjuster for the construction insurance syndicate, and an independent legal counsel specializing in corporate fraud. They moved silently to the empty seats at the far end of the table. Graham unbuttoned his suit jacket, stood behind his leather chair, and reached into his heavy briefcase. He pulled out a stack of thick, wire-bound documents. He slid them smoothly down the polished mahogany. One stopped in front of the underwriter, one in front of the insurer, and one slid directly in front of Mason. The stark black text printed across the bright red cover page read, Independent Risk Review. "Graham," Mason started, his voice jumping a pitch higher than its usual smooth baritone, the panic bleeding through the veneer. "What exactly is this?" "We are here to sign the final capitalization round and announce the board transition. The technical reviews were completely closed out 3 weeks ago." Graham looked at him with the cold, sterile detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. "The internal reviews were closed. Mason, the independent risk review was finalized at 4 o'clock this morning." Mason's gaze snapped to me. Pure, unfiltered venom flashed briefly in his eyes before he desperately tried to pivot back to his audience. He let out a short, dismissive laugh, leaning his hands heavily on the table to project authority, desperately trying to construct a counterattack out of thin air. "Gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this highly irregular interruption," Mason said, directing his words to the bankers and underwriters. "My sister, Zara, has a history of creating unnecessary complications. She operates a very small, very isolated consulting business from her apartment and completely lacks the executive context to understand a merger of this massive scale. We have some unfortunate, ongoing family friction, and it seems she has managed to temporarily confuse my father-in-law with a deeply biased, personal vendetta. I assure you, her technical opinions are completely compromised by her emotional instability and resentment." He looked toward the end of the table, silently begging the other powerful men to side with the polished executive over the disgruntled, jealous sibling. But the lethal blow did not come from my data, and it did not come from Graham's authority. It came from the woman sitting to my right. Celeste Whitmore stepped forward and placed her hands flat on the mahogany table. She did not look at her husband with the tears of a betrayed bride. She looked at him with absolute, freezing, aristocratic contempt. "She is not emotionally unstable. Mason," Celeste said, her voice ringing out clear, sharp, and perfectly steady, slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "And this is not a petty family vendetta. You lied to me. You lied to my father. You deliberately hid material stop-work warnings from the municipal zoning board for 6 weeks prior to our wedding ceremony." The color drained entirely from Mason's face, leaving him looking like chalk. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed him. "You weaponized my family name," Celeste continued, her gaze pinning him ruthlessly to the floor. You deliberately used your relationship with me to bully the financial compliance officers into ignoring severe structural deficits. You forced accelerated funding decisions and pressured me into signing heavily altered asset appendices while deliberately concealing the fact that your flagship project was mathematically doomed. You did not want a wife. You wanted a corporate shield. At the center of the table, Daniel and Linda Rivers sat completely paralyzed. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed violently near his temple, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. My mother looked as though the oxygen had been vacuumed directly out of her lungs, her chest barely moving. They were trapped in their chairs, forced to watch the golden armor of their perfect son being violently, systematically ripped away. They were watching his destruction not in the privacy of their living room, but in front of the very billionaires they had sacrificed my dignity to impress. The air in the room was so dense it felt difficult to pull into my lungs. Every small movement felt magnified, every breath amplified in the suffocating quiet. I walked past the frozen executives. I walked past my horrified parents. I walked past my brother, whose perfectly manicured hands were now visibly trembling against the edge of the mahogany table. I walked directly to the head of the boardroom. I set my laptop down and plugged the single interface cable from the podium into the side of the machine. The massive corporate logo on the presentation screen instantly vanished. It was replaced by the stark, complex digital topography of the Cinder Landing Foundation grid, rendered in chilling, high-definition detail. I did not smile. I did not clear my throat, and I did not ask the room for their attention. I simply reached out and initiated the predictive structural collapse sequence. As the simulation began to run, highlighting the fraudulent retaining walls and the compromised soil mesh in glowing, undeniable crimson, I looked away from the massive screen. I looked directly into my brother's eyes. Mason slowly looked around the long mahogany table, frantically searching the faces of the underwriter, the insurance adjuster, his father-in-law, and his wife. He found no sympathy. He found no allies. He saw only the cold, unforgiving calculus of federal indictments and total financial ruin settling permanently over the room. And in that terrifying, stretched-out second of silence, just before the first digital concrete slab fractured on the screen behind me, Mason finally understood the reality of his situation. He realized that absolutely no one in this room was looking at me as a joke anymore. I pressed the advance button on the presenter remote. The massive screen shifted from the terrifying digital collapse model to a stark, split-screen timeline. On the left side, I displayed the legally mandated engineering safety requirements. On the right side, I projected the actual procurement invoices. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a tearful monologue about the tragedy of family betrayal. I let the raw, undeniable mathematics act as the executioner. This is the soil remediation data, I stated, my voice echoing slightly against the cold glass walls of the boardroom. It is a 98% text match to a public works project completed in Nevada 6 years ago. The digital signature authorizing this environmental clearance belongs to a senior geotechnical auditor who was formally terminated by this company 8 months before the document was even created. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed from the risk adjusters seated at the far end of the table. A forged environmental signature was not a simple rounding error or a minor administrative oversight. It was a severe, undeniable felony. I clicked the remote a second time. A complex financial flowchart materialized on the screen, mapping a web of corporate entities. The capital saved by secretly downgrading the foundational materials was not absorbed back into the project contingency budget. It was aggressively diverted into a network of newly incorporated ghost companies. I used the digital pointer to highlight Vanguard Subterranean. This specific vendor billed $800,000 in consultation fees over a span of merely 3 months. They possess no heavy machinery, no operational history, and no verifiable employees. The registered legal agent is Julian Vance, a former college roommate of your vice president of development. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen flashed to display the banking wire transfer routing numbers, tracking the stolen capital as it flowed from Vanguard directly into a private domestic trust fund. I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the financial underwriters. The risk of a catastrophic structural failure was deliberately pushed onto the future buyers of these properties, while the stolen capital was immediately liquidated for personal debt relief. Graham Whitmore leaned forward, his large hands resting flat on the heavy leather portfolio in front of him. I have spent the last 12 hours reviewing these findings with the primary underwriters and the construction insurance syndicate, Graham announced, his voice carrying the heavy terminal weight of a judge reading a final sentence. They have uniformly confirmed that we are no longer looking at weak management or aggressive cost optimization. This is the systematic concealment of material information. It is premeditated fraud. Celeste did not wait for Mason to formulate a defense. She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents. She dropped them onto the polished mahogany table with a heavy, definitive thud. These are formal legal requests to annul specific post-nuptial financial clauses, Celeste declared, her gaze fixed entirely on the man she had married just weeks prior. Furthermore, my legal counsel has already drafted a statement of full cooperation. I will voluntarily provide every email, every draft agreement, and every private schedule you use to manipulate my father's firm. If the state requires testimony regarding how you utilized our marriage as a timeline to force this fraudulent funding through, I will absolutely take the stand. The shield had completely shattered. The marriage he had constructed to protect his crimes was now the primary weapon being used to dismantle him. At the center of the table, Daniel and Linda Rivers seemed to shrink physically into their expensive leather chairs. The independent legal counsel, a man with cold, calculating eyes, turned his attention directly to them. Regarding the diverted capital, the lawyer stated, his tone devoid of any social courtesy, the $250,000 routed through the ghost contractor was deposited into a trust fund bearing your names, which was then immediately used to clear a commercial mortgage. You should both be aware that when the state begins its forensic audit, you will be subpoenaed. Ignorance of the technical engineering will not protect you from the legal liability of receiving stolen corporate funds. All the color instantly vanished from my mother's face. My father's rigid, aristocratic posture collapsed entirely, his shoulders slumping forward in sudden, terrifying defeat. For the very first time in their lives, they understood the true cost of their golden boy. The money Mason had brought home was not a victory lap. It was the kindling that was about to burn their entire fabricated reality to the ground. They were going to lose the house, the country club memberships, and the pristine social reputation they had happily sacrificed me to protect, Mason finally snapped. The suffocating weight of the evidence completely broke his carefully cultivated executive persona. He slammed his hands onto the mahogany table, pushing himself to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "This is completely insane," Mason shouted, his voice cracking, a desperate, feral edge replacing his usual smooth charm. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "You are actually going to listen to her. She is a bitter, outsourced contractor who failed out of the corporate industry 3 years ago. She is doing all of this because she is incredibly jealous. She has always been jealous of me. She is just trying to destroy my career because she never had the talent to build one of her own." He looked wildly around the room, begging the billionaires, his wife, and his father-in-law to see the crazy, vindictive sister he had been selling them for a decade. Graham Whitmore stood up. He did not yell. He simply projected his voice with the absolute, crushing authority of a man who owned the very air in the room. "No," Graham said, his words cutting through Mason's frantic shouting like a steel blade. "She is just the only person in this room who saw what you thought you had buried." The silence that followed was total and absolute. Mason stood frozen, his arms still raised, looking desperately at the faces of the people who held his entire future in their hands. He saw no belief. He saw no forgiveness. He saw only the cold, hard reality of powerful men calculating their immediate legal distance from a criminal. Graham looked at the independent board members sitting at the far end of the table. "I call for an immediate vote to indefinitely freeze the Cinder Landing project and physically seal all internal data servers." The underwriters and insurance adjusters nodded in unanimous, silent agreement. "Mason Rivers," Graham continued, turning back to my brother, "your employment with Northwake Development Group is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. We are transferring the entirety of this forensic audit to the state civil and criminal investigative divisions. I highly suggest you retain federal defense counsel before the end of the day." Mason slowly lowered his hand. He looked at his wife, who refused to meet his eye, staring coldly straight ahead. He looked at his parents, who were staring blankly at the polished table, completely paralyzed by their own impending ruin. Finally, he looked at me. There was no hatred left in his eyes, only the hollow, terrified realization that his immense charisma, his perfectly tailored suits, and his golden smile could not save him from the undeniable truth of the math. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, the heavy wooden doors clicking shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. An hour later, the room had entirely emptied. The bankers and lawyers had rushed back to their respective offices to initiate massive damage control protocols. My parents had slipped away silently, walking like ghosts toward an incredibly dark and public nightmare. Only Graham and I remained in the boardroom. Graham poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and walked over to where I was packing away my laptop. "The senior vice president chair is currently vacant," Graham said casually, leaning against the edge of the mahogany table. "You just proved you have the sharpest analytical mind in this entire state. I want you to take the title, Zara. I want you to run the entire risk division for Whitmore Civic Capital." It was the ultimate corporate prize. It was the corner office, the massive salary, and the absolute, undeniable proof of my success. It was exactly the kind of validation my family had always demanded. I closed my laptop bag and looked up at the billionaire. "I appreciate the offer, Graham, truly, but I am going to decline." Graham raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by the rejection. "Why?" "Because I do not want the flashy chair, and I have absolutely no desire to be a corporate executive," I told him, securing the heavy bag over my shoulder. "I am an independent auditor. I will take a standalone contract to lead the remediation team for Cinder Landing. I will fix the foundation. I will make the site safe, and I will submit my invoices directly to your finance department." I walked toward the double doors, feeling lighter and stronger than I had in 3 decades. I realized in that quiet moment that true victory was not about sitting at the head of a mahogany table or acquiring a heavy title just to impress people who did not matter. True victory was forcing an entire room full of the most powerful people in the city to finally look at the facts, drop the toxic labels, and call me by my real name. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this journey. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.